In our modern culture, we don't always appreciate the idea of power, strength, strong men. And one of the reasons for that is because, well, most of us don't think we need to look out for ourselves. We have armies and law enforcement that are there to try to keep us safe from people that would do us harm. And as a result, well, we don't think about what we need. But you go back in history, and this was not always the case. And if you go back to the book of Genesis, and we read about Abraham, we find that Abraham had 300 fighting men capable of war. And it was like a private army. And he used them to go off and rescue his nephew Lot from capture because he had been taken captive in the war of the kings of the valley. And why would Abraham need 300 fighting men in the first place? Because Abraham had lots of flocks, lots of cattle. He was abundant, and he lived at a time where you had raiding parties from other cities that would send out large groups of strong men to go out and steal livestock. Why worry about your own if you can just acquire somebody else and steal them and they can't do anything about it? So if you have your own personal private army, you can protect your livestock. It's something we don't worry about. But that image, this image of strong men and people that could take care of these things, was something that was very ingrained in the culture in which our Old Testaments were written. And so we're going to have terms for strength, and those words for strength are words that are going to be used of God. And perhaps maybe illustrate for you and I this idea of strength. In 1 Chronicles 29, as David is preparing to have the temple built and he's collecting materials for the building of the temple, he tells the people, this is what I've collected. He says, and if any of you would like to contribute, you can. And in regard to that, with regard to the other people then contributing to this, he says in verse 11, yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, indeed everything that is in the heavens and in the earth. Yours is the dominion, O Lord, and you exalt yourself as head over all. And this word for power is our word gibor. And it's a word that was used of men that were strong, they weren't feeble, they didn't need help getting themselves up. They could raise themselves up to fight. It was contrasted to another Hebrew term called an ish, a common man. But a gibor man was a strong man. In fact, there's a form of this word that's used of a strong woman over in the book of Proverbs, a woman that actually could really do a lot of work, and it was considered valuable quality in a wife. In Psalm 106, as he's looking back over what had happened at the Red Sea, it says, our fathers in Egypt did not understand your wonders. They did not remember your abundant kindness, but they rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea. In other words, they got there and they're like, oh, we should have gone back, and now we're trapped. And they moan and groan about this in verse 8. Nevertheless, he saved them for the sake of his name, that he might make his power. And he has this word, givora. Again, now this word, like a givor man, a strong man that could fight in a battle, that could raise himself up. He might make his power known. So this is one of the terms. The term that was used for a strong man, they would have understood this when this was applied to God. It's like looking at God as a strong man, a man that doesn't need anybody to help him up, doesn't need anybody to support him. This was one way of God looking at himself. In Ezra chapter 8, as they are preparing to return from Babylon to Israel, and they've been given all these materials. If you remember, when they were taken captive, before the captivity began, the king of Babylon had confiscated a whole bunch of the implements that were in part of the temple, gold implements and silver implements, and all this is going back. And if we read here, Ezra 8 and verse 22, for I was ashamed to request from the king troops and horsemen to protect us from the enemy on the way, because we had said to the king, the hand of our God, and I think this is very interesting, we were talking about that image of a hand being strong. The hand of our God is favorably, or it is good disposed to all those who seek him, but his power, and here we have a different word. We have the word over here, odes. His power and his anger are against all those who forsake him. And if you keep reading down here, you find out that as they traveled, made this trip from Babylon back to Jerusalem, and that return trip, that Ezra says, and God's hand did protect them. He did exercise his strength to protect them from ambushes and from enemies. Because they've got, it's not just that there are people out there to take, it's the fact that they're traveling with a lot of very valuable items, things that people actually could have used. They could have taken the gold and the silver and stolen it and melted it down, used it for themselves selfishly. But God protected them. And he uses this word. I always think of this word. I remember way back in seminary when you learn this Hebrew term, I was thinking of like the Wizard of Oz, because that's kind of the way you'd spell this in English, except I always grew up learning to say odes when I would say this. But a related idea, talking about God's power in this way. In fact, I think an illustration of this I like in 2 Samuel chapter 6, when David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem, or to Jerusalem. It hadn't been there before. And it says, and David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. Odes. Today we have that expression, dance like no one's watching, no one's looking. And David is just so happy and so excited that God is returning, that as he's dancing, he probably, when he was done, he's probably panting hard and he's sweating because he is dancing with such joy and celebration of the ark returning to Jerusalem. And it's a good illustration of this might. You can think of that person that gets so excited about something that it exudes this excitement in their very super energetic activity. And so you can get this picture of David dancing in this way with all his might, all his strength. In Isaiah chapter 62, we have this again, when it's talking about a time in the future in which God is no longer going to punish Israel. And it says, and the Lord has sworn by his right hand. And again, this is not the word yod now. This is just the word yamin, but it does refer to the right hand. That was my left hand. I should hold in my right hand. By my right hand, and by his strong, and there's our word odes, arm. Remember we looked at these images just the other day when he was talking about the hand and the strong arm? Well, here it's his oats and it's his arm. I will never again give your grain as food for your enemies. That was one of the punishments that God had. You're going to grow grain, but your enemies are going to come and they're going to take it. That's one of the things you're going to be punished with. And he says, I'm not going to do that anymore to you. And he's looking at a future time in which he will implement this promise for these people. Lastly, in Psalm chapter 78, he's looking at a time in the past in which Israel had whined and complained because they wanted food. And he says in the context above, he gave them manna, he gave them this bread. But he also said in verse 26, and he caused the east wind to blow in the heavens. And by his power, and there's that odes again, by his power, he directed the south wind. So this power was what caused that south wind, and when he rained meat upon them like dust. So he brought all those quail in, and they were out there, and the people were able to go out and harvest quail. And it's his power that made that wind blow, that caused those quail to come in and rain upon them. I did have one more that I wanted to look at this. This is an account in Psalm 59 where David is celebrating. He's writing a song of celebration because God has protected him at a time when Saul had laid in wait, tried to take him. And one of the things he requests in this case, he says, do not slay them, or my people will forget. Scatter them by your power. And this word for power is the word heal. And its word means to whirl, to dance, to travail like a woman going in labor. But this particular form as it's used is usually understood to do all that, but to exercise firmness. So it's a power that is firm, a power that is unmovable. And he says, scatter them by your power. In other words, I don't want you to kill them. People will forget. They're dead, they're gone. People will forget what happened. But if you scatter them, so that they aren't established where they're supposed to be, but you do it by your established power, by your firmness, by your firm power, and bring them down. O Lord, our shield. Again, a shield, another implement of protection and warfare and all of this. And he says, this is what I call for. So all these different terms, strength and power, strong men, terms that they saw because they were in a culture in which they were constantly in jeopardy of another nation or another city nearby coming to take their crop that they just had harvested, their livestock that they had raised and matured. And they understood this very vividly in their minds of God exercising. They pictured and saw this strength of God that was there to come to their rescue, to provide for them, to provide food for them. And hopefully that causes us to understand this God, this protector that they saw him, he still has this same kind of power for us. Because, yeah, you and I also need protection, and we're going to look at some New Testament examples where his power is valuable for us, and it's going to accomplish other things than just protecting. But they really saw it very vividly in terms of God's divine protection of them in these sometimes very tough and very harsh circumstances. We ought to be able to worship God this way. Because even though God may not do for us the things he did for David, or for the people of Israel, he's still a God of power and strength, and he has other promises he's made to us. And those promises he's made to us, many of those promises depend upon his power. As we saw yesterday, his ability to hold us firmly in his hand to keep us secure. That's part of God's power and a promise for which we can worship him and praise him. And with that, I encourage you to have a good day in the Lord, and I thank you for joining me today.